All right. Good afternoon, everybody. So today we're going to be talking about definitely a little bit of a hot topic right now, cybersecurity in medical devices. We're talking about that regulatory pathway, direction for approval, and then some of the best practices, and then some stories on how things can go well and how things can go wrong. So go ahead and start getting right into it. So the first question that I want to ask, directed towards manufacturers, directed towards MedTech innovators, directed towards anyone in the space, is how confident are you that your device's cybersecurity strategy is going to work the first time around? We work with a lot of manufacturers that aren't really sure what their strategy is going into it. They have an internal IT department handling cybersecurity, or they're outsourcing their cybersecurity to another IT department. But this is different. This is going to be towards medical device cybersecurity strategy. It's a little bit different from general network security. So it's important to have a good roadmap and a good plan. And we're going to talk about some of the best practices, where to start, where to finish, and everything in between. So a little bit of background about myself. I'm Trevor Slattery. I'm the Chief Technology Officer over at Blue Goat Cyber. So my background comes from application security and red teaming, moved more into the product security, and I like to say that cybersecurity is ultimately always regulatory driven. However, this is especially true in regulated industries, of which cyber devices, medical devices, and healthcare in general seem to be one of the most regulated industries. So it's a bit of a natural transition moving into this space. I've worked with just about every type of medical device, namely the cyber devices that you can think of. You can list some examples of some of our products that we've cleared here coming up. But insulin pumps, implantable devices, giant diagnostic machines, everything in between. In my free time, when I'm not reading through all this regulatory documentation, I'm an avid rock climber and a free diver. I used to be a commercial fisherman, so that was kind of my background before I got into application security. And my personal attachment, so I was the victim of a very unfortunate heart condition that has now thankfully been fully treated, fully cured. But that led to, when I was a kid, being saved by a medical device after flight for life due to sudden cardiac arrest. And so after that, I had all sorts of heart monitors hooked up to me for the longest time. Back in the day, they had to download it off of the machine. Now they can send everything up to the cloud. It's a pretty cool system. But that started spurring my interest in medicine in general. And then that cybersecurity background was an easy transition. Now, a little bit of background on our company, Blue Goat Cyber. So we've guided hundreds of manufacturers and dealt with hundreds of submissions into the FDA, into the MDR, PMDA in Japan, NMPA in China. Just about anywhere where they're driving regulation for medical devices, we've handled it one way or another. We've worked with that initial submission as well as deficiency response. So if a manufacturer submits into the FDA, they get kicked back for one reason or another, we can work with what they have to make sure that we're getting it through the next time. If they're coming to us at the start, we'll get it through the first time. We've worked with just about every kind of device you can think of. I know I listed some of them. Infusion pumps, CGMs, wearable devices, patient monitors, pacemakers, implanted devices, critical care machines, surgical robots, pretty widespread of different products. And then, of course, in the startup space, we're seeing all sorts of novel technology come out every day, really fascinating stuff. So we have a 100% success rate with FDA, MDR, and any regulatory submission. We've never once had a rejection for any product that we have submitted to be cleared. That's why when we're going through our services, we offer a guarantee. Anyone working with us, we're guaranteeing that you're getting approved, and we will work with you at no additional cost until you do get approved. So that was a little bit of the mandatory plug for the company. Now I can talk about some of the regulatory paths. So the first thing that I want to talk about is sort of that background behind cybersecurity. Oftentimes I get asked why cybersecurity for medical devices. A lot of people may not even be aware that it's a big problem in medical products. Now, by this year, around 68% of medical devices are going to be network connected, which is obviously a massive uptick from the past when everything was done on paper. Health records were stored in a file. Now health records are stored through EHR systems. Everything is done digitally. And more devices, or smart devices, the IoMT, Internet of Medical Things, everything's hooked up to the internet in one way or another. So these are just massive entry points for attackers. The attack surface, so things that we can try to hack into, is expanding rapidly. A big concern is ransomware. That's a topic that everyone's heard of. They've heard about the oil pipeline ransomware, but it's especially a big concern in hospitals. Hospitals are often prime targets for ransomware, as they're using legacy networks and legacy systems that have a lot of problems and are very prone to attack. It's easy for a hacker to try to target a hospital and exfiltrate whatever they can or try to extort them for money. Now, with hospitals, there's an extreme time pressure. If everything is shut down in a hospital, obviously there are massive delays in treatment, delays in care, and there's even a risk of death. A study was recently conducted by the University of California in San Diego on what are the ramifications of a hospital getting ransomware attacks. And within that hospital, typically they have to shut down. They send patients to neighboring hospitals. They noticed an uptick of about 80% in cases of cardiac arrest in the event of a ransomware attack, as well as reduced survival rate after ransomware attacks. This is just due to massive stress on the neighboring hospitals and, of course, stress on the treatment providers for having this massive influx. There was recently a case of a treatment center for cancer treatment in the UK. They were hit by a ransomware attack, and for several weeks they were unable to provide any services, and patients were dying due to lack of treatment. So it's a massive, massive problem that we're facing. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about is how we're properly integrating cybersecurity into your network, into your roadmap, and into your device, of course. The first thing that I want to talk about is road mapping. Road mapping is a very important part of developing a medical device, and a lot of times there are some misunderstandings on where cybersecurity needs to be built in. With something like human factors or clinical trials, there's typically a block where you do them. You pick a set of time and you go through the process. Cybersecurity is often treated the same way, but it's not effective to treat it that way. You need to start with cybersecurity and move all the way down the line. The FDA states that devices should be built with cybersecurity in mind. They should be built secure instead of trying to bolt it on at the end. And that's unfortunately what too many manufacturers are doing. What this is doing is this is leading to costly overruns. If they submit to the FDA, their design was insufficient, they'll get rejected. If they have to try to retrofit it at the end, it's still likely not going to be as fast. They're going to have to run into overtime where they aren't selling their product, they aren't approved, they're trying to chase down all of these things they could have covered at the beginning. So when we're talking about where to roadmap, cybersecurity should be treated in the same process as development. It should start when development starts, and it should go all the way through the continued life cycle of the product. The next thing I want to talk about is integrating cybersecurity into a quality system. So ISO 13485 is the golden standard for a quality management system, especially in the medical context. What we're looking at here is what processes are you building out for risk management? How are you ensuring that everything is clean, traceable, you have secure and safe documentation? I'm sure touring the expo at this convention, you've seen a lot of people talking about ISO 13485 compliance. It's extremely, extremely important. Manufacturers need to be aware of this. Any of the service providers manufacturers are working with should have this sort of compliance at the front of mind. It's very important to make sure that any documentation you're preparing is going to be out the box ready to go for 13485. Now, as we're developing software documentation, secure software documentation has been a known best practice in the industry since the 90s. This is nothing new. What has been new is security documentation to go along with the software documentation. You may have your functional requirements for software. What does the product do? You need to have security requirements for the product. So how do you secure these functionalities? This is something new that the industry is still catching up to. And it's just as important to have this built out throughout the development process so that you aren't blindsided by it when it comes time to submit. Another very important thing is going into risk management. So organizations, as part of a good 13485 quality system, should have risk management processes in their organization. This needs to cover safety risk management, security risk management, business risk management, financial risk management, though in this space what we're concerned about is safety and security. There's a very close intersection when we're talking about a medical device. Obviously, security and cybersecurity, but safety is the next best step. They tie in very closely together, and when we're looking at what a good safety risk management framework is, that's built on ISO 14971. That is for safety risk management, and that talks about how you're handling a problem or any situation, how you triage it to make sure that you're managing patient safety. Now, for security risk management, that's AAMI TIR57. That talks about security risk management. The two frameworks look nearly identical. They're very, very similar, and they even discuss how they should feed into each other. Now, this just goes to show exactly how closely these two are tied into each other, safety and security. It's important when you're building out your quality system to have these sort of be at the front of mind. How are we handling risk management? Now, I know I alluded to this earlier, but what we really need to focus on is security by design. This is a constant process, and it shouldn't be something that we're just doing in a phase. We should start with security in that initial phase when we're looking at the requirements phase. So requirements are stating, what does your product do? You have your functional requirements, you have your non-functional requirements, how does it do it? And the security requirements should be part of those non-functional requirements. We'll go into the design. That's any threat modeling activities, design review, making sure that this initial idea of the product is going to meet any scrutiny that we have. We'll go into testing. This should be a continuous effort. Anytime a change is made, it should be tested and verified. This is verification and validation testing. This can be cybersecurity testing, such as static testing or analysis of the supply chain, and just moving down the line. And then finally, we're getting to deployment. Our deployment of a finished product needs to be just as secure as well. If we're just sending it off, we don't have any checks and balances, we don't know if that deployment server is secured. There are a lot of considerations that the FDA is really going to drill into as you're approaching your submission date. And this isn't unique just to the US, this is present in Europe, this is present in Asian submissions. Anywhere that you're trying to get into a regulatory body, this will be a problem. What we typically recommend is building it directly into your continuous integration and continuous development. So as you're designing your product, as you're making changes, you can have everything set up through a SSDLC, a secure software development lifecycle. That's talking about how we can do testing anytime a change is made without having to manually go in and do all of this testing. So it's a good way to make sure that all of your boxes are checked and there aren't going to be any surprises towards the end. Now, as we're building a product, development and security are something that go hand in hand. Having said that, developers don't always understand the best security practices. Typically, that's where a cybersecurity professional comes in. They're seen as a little bit too divided in some cases. However, from a matter of expertise, both are very complex topics. Understanding key development principles and understanding how to be a very good developer is different from understanding core security principles and how to be a very good hacker or a defender. So having a good blend of experience and having different teams and different individuals who can help meet these goals is very important. So we typically don't recommend that you leave security to your developers. If you have a developer with security background, that's perfect. But in general, we want to make sure that someone with very good security background is talking about these problems. Now, of course, there are several different ways you can go about this. In our process and in our experience, we found that there are 5 key phases that help us through this process very smoothly and very quickly. And this is going to meet all of the different FDA expectations that we might find. So we're starting with risk management. That's essentially getting everything built into a QMS. We're going back to what I addressed earlier, where we want to talk about any of the different risk management frameworks that we need, any of the key quality systems that we need to go into place. And then we're moving down into phase 2. That's our risk assessment. So risk assessment, we're assuming, okay, we have a minimum viable product or a prototype of some sort. It's out there, it's functional, it's ready to be interacted with. This is where we're going to start our threat modeling, what can go wrong with it. This is where we're going to start our testing. How can we verify what can go wrong with it? Threat modeling is a hypothetical exercise. We're trying to think about what are the potential bad things that can happen. How can we potentially harm a patient? When we're testing, we're verifying what we think can happen. And so the list of things that go into cybersecurity testing could take up hours of its own conversation. But in general, we're looking at analysis of the code. We're looking at analysis of what goes into the code, so any of the libraries or components that you're using. And then, the general different types of penetration testing to make sure that the device can't be hacked. Once we've identified what can go wrong there, we're going to move down to the controls. Controls are essentially implementing fixes. We found problems, how are we going to fix it? We're going to want to build out all of our documentation based on these controls, identify residual risk, and make any revisions as needed based on controls. And then we're finally moving into our QA/QC checks to make sure that everything is going to be regulatory ready, and we're ready to go to the FDA, or we're ready to go to the MDR. Now, when we're building out all of these risk management procedures, the internal SOPs, the internal practices and policies that we have should be focused on very, very early. It's not something that should happen halfway through product development. Before we start designing a product, how are we going to understand what we are going to do if there's a problem with the product? So that's why we recommend that this is something that should be done very early. Now, one area that causes a lot of contention is the difference between FDA guidance and eSTAR. They're fairly close as far as what they say you should do. However, they're not exact. So eSTAR is the FDA's electronic submission program. It's meant to guide manufacturers, make sure that they have an easy to understand and sort of checklist approach to going through a regulatory submission. Now, when you're reading what you need to do to prepare documentation for eSTAR, there are a list of guidance documents, and they don't line up 100%. There are a few gaps in between which ones, what you should do in certain situations. Typically, a good rule of thumb is eSTAR is more dynamically updated. If the FDA is going to change guidance documents, they're going to publish draft guidance, they're going to collect feedback from the community, and it's a long and involved process. The FDA is making changes to eSTAR without approval. They can do it at any time, and it happens all the time. I think we're on version 5 of eSTAR right now, so it's a very quick process. eSTAR is usually going to be more up-to-date than the FDA guidance. So when they're making small changes, it's a good approach to make sure that your procedures and your documents are developed with eSTAR at the front of mind. Now, I already mentioned this briefly, but when we're looking at safety and security, they blend together massively. So again, that's going to be that ISO 14971 and AAMI TIR57 for safety and security risk management. We want to make sure that both of these procedures are in place. They should be clearly defined separate procedures. However, there's a lot of blend between the two. Reading through the guidance and reading through the standards, they discuss where the two standards can intersect. Typically, that's going to be during the assessment phase. If you identify a cybersecurity risk, you may see it also has a safety risk and vice versa. So we want to make sure these policies are in place before we start working on the product. We want to make sure that they are separate yet connected. Now we're moving into the risk assessment. So when we're getting into this phase 2, we're collecting vulnerability information, weak points. This is through our testing, our dynamic testing, static testing, the bill of materials analysis, penetration testing, any of that cybersecurity testing. We're looking for all of these weak points, and then we have to score them. How are we assessing this risk? Is it a minimal concern? Is it top priority? And this is something that we need to figure out what's the best way to assess risk. In the medical space, it's very different from traditional IT security. If we're talking about a risk to this clicker right here, or this microphone, it's not going to be the same risk as if it's in a pacemaker, even if it's the same vulnerability. So we have to look at a way to classify this. Now, this is a risk scoring process that we have found to be very successful. When we're looking at the impact scores, so minor, moderate, major, significant, we're talking about what is going to happen to an individual. Is this going to be a minor inconvenience? Could this be slightly delayed treatment? Is this going to be significantly delayed treatment? Could this lead to patient harm, patient death even? And even under that context, it can be different. If we're looking at a delay in diagnosis for cancer, cancer is not going to change in a day. It's likely not going to change in 2 days. So having a delay by a day or two is not going to be the same as sepsis, where a matter of minutes can mean life or death. So we have to look at the device. We have to understand what is the risk in this implementation. When we're looking at the exploitability score, so this is based off of CVSS, which is a system, and it's essentially just a formula for scoring risk based on varying factors. What we're considering here are what are the situations that must be true to exploit a vulnerability. Do I have to have my hands on the device, or can it be in another room? Do I need to have a password to do this? And so we're looking at objective metrics so that any two assessors come to the same conclusion. The FDA requires that these are objective. You can't use something subjective like probability or likelihood. They don't want to see that. Now we're moving into the risk control side of things. So we've identified all these problems. We know what can go wrong with the device. How are we going to stop it? For each problem, we have to identify a compensating control. This can be complete, or this can just be a partial control. We might say we have a critical vulnerability and we can control it down to a low or a medium. Or we have a medium vulnerability and we can completely remove it from the system. As long as we're getting it down to an acceptable level of risk, that's just all we need to do. When we're looking at the approach, it's going to depend on where you're submitting. Typically, the rule of thumb that we like to follow for an FDA submission is lows are usually going to be considered acceptable. Mediums will usually be considered acceptable by the FDA. We like to avoid mediums wherever possible without a very solid justification. Anything past that, we don't want to see. If you're looking at certain markets, such as namely China and Korea, they tend to have a little bit less risk tolerance. And so when you're branching into mediums, you need to have an extremely good justification for why those remain in the system. Usually when we're seeing a European submission, it's falling a little bit closer to FDA standards. Now, any controls that we have need to map back to the requirements. So if we identify a problem, we've identified a new security requirement. We need to have verification and validation testing. We need to make sure that everything is secure and safe in the system and that our fixes didn't implement any problems. So there are always checks and balances anytime we're making a change. We need to make sure that controls are covering a balance of safety, security, and functionality. This is one thing that cybersecurity teams can often miss the mark a little bit on. We want everything to be 100% secure. We want there to be no way to hack into a system, and the only way to do that is to lock it in a box and bury it in the desert. As long as it's going to be within interaction of humans or on a network, there is going to be some level of risk. So we have to find a way to balance between security and functionality. That's why I mentioned we might take a critical down to a medium, but not resolve it altogether. There might be a reason why we need to keep it in the system in some way or another. If we remove it altogether, we're removing key functionality. Now we need to look at residual risk. So we talked about what can make a risk acceptable, when can we have a risk still in the system. Once we've identified these risks, we need to document it, we need to explain why we can keep it, and then importantly, we need to disclose it. So when we're preparing labeling documentation, we need to state any risk that a patient or an operator could be exposed to in the system. That's where we're talking about this residual risk. And as we're implementing these controls, we're likely changing certain aspects of the device. We may have a new control in place that wasn't there before that we need to build back into the documentation. So it can be a cyclical process until we get to a final good mark where we're ready to submit to the FDA. The next thing is, of course, looking at that QA and QC checks. So we want to make sure that everything lines up with what the FDA says, everything is good, everything is clear, and then we want to make sure everything is structured for eSTAR. So, like I said, eSTAR is sort of a checklist approach. You have all of these different boxes that you need to tick, or it won't even let you submit. It tells you the headings of what you need to do. We need to make sure that everything is structured in that fashion. And the reason we want to keep that structure precise instead of just kind of having everything in one place and referencing out to it is some of these submission packets can be massive, thousands of pages long. Typically, when we're working with a cybersecurity packet, we see it ranging up to even around 600 pages, purely of cybersecurity documentation. It's very easy if it's a single reviewer going through 600 pages to miss something or to not know exactly the structure of how you're handling your documentation. That's why we want this to line up with eSTAR. If it's lining up with eSTAR, it's going to be very direct and very easy for your FDA reviewer to see it. That's going to cut down on your review time. That's going to cut down on the risk of getting a request for additional information. And ultimately, that's going to fast track your approval process. Now, as long as we've gone through this whole process, we're continually making changes to the documentation. We want to make sure that no more changes are required. Is everything accurately reflecting new controls? Is everything accurately reflecting residual risk? Once we have a good understanding of what's been done, we have a good understanding of what needs to go to the FDA. Now, I want to talk about a recent example from a client that we were working with where they came to us for a deficiency response. Ultimately, this was a long back and forth between the FDA, and we recently received the great news that they've been approved for sale. But I want to talk about some of the pitfalls that they went into, how we fixed them, and what you can do to avoid them. So this is a large medical device company that was submitting a 510(k) for a diagnostic system. There was no clear procedure in place. They were in development for a very, very long time, in development for close to 10 years. So it was an old product. And in that time, the new FDA cybersecurity guidance came out. They weren't prepared for it from previous artifacts. They had old systems in place, old documentation in place, and they were unaware that they needed to update all of this to sort of retrofit the new policies into place. When the time came for submission, they submitted with what they had, which was based on general IT security procedures, based on some basic software documentation, and that warranted a quick rejection from the FDA. Now, it was a game of essentially catch up from that point. We were in a review cycle for 360 days until we got the notice that they had been approved. And each time there was an identified issue, it led to sort of a waterfall effect where one issue led to another, led to another. The first main problem, and the problem that likely became the hardest to overcome, was that risk assessment methodology. So I want to go back to what I had mentioned. Let's see, bring it over here. When we're looking at this risk assessment, we're looking at patient harm, and we're looking at these objective metrics. Their risk assessment was focused on system harm and probabilistic measures. Now, like I said, the FDA really does not want to see probabilistic measures, and they want to see you really considering what can happen to an individual if something goes wrong. In this case, neither of those were considered. They had been doing risk assessments and threat modeling for almost 10 years on this product under this old system, and they had to go back and redo everything over the course of a year to make sure that it met new regulatory standards. So, of course, at the start of that project, there was no way to know that this FDA guidance was going to become finalized and that, before there was no draft guidance. But about halfway through, about 5 years into that development cycle, the draft guidance was published. And then it was finalized in September of 2023 until the product was finally cleared in 2025. So there was time to prepare for this, and having those additional years of work did not contribute to speeding along their approval process. Now, what eventually we did was essentially just that. We started over. We said, there's so much going back, there's so much history with this product, what can we do to make this work the best? We're going to start over with our new threat modeling. We're treating this like a new product, and we're working our way from the ground up with all the cybersecurity documentation. It had been 10 years in the making for all of that, and once we started from the ground up using our approach, it was 2 months until clearance. We went through all the threat modeling, we went through all the testing, we went through all the risk assessment, all the verification, all the validation, making sure all the controls were in place, responded to every single one of the FDA considerations. It was a long fought battle, but eventually we get through. So what the big lesson here is just be ready for these things. Pay attention to what the regulators are saying. What is the FDA saying is going to be the next step? They're publishing draft guidance well before they finalize it. In January of this year, they recently published the AI-enabled device guidance. It's draft in its current state, so it is not mandated, it's not enforced. You do not have to adhere to the AI guidance right now. Once it's finalized, you will have to. And the reason the FDA publishes this draft guidance so well in advance is so that manufacturers and innovators can be prepared. You want to know what may come up down the line. This goes back to the original point of just how are you road mapping this? When are you planning to release your product? If you're planning to release your product tomorrow, you probably don't need to worry too much about this AI guidance. If you're planning to release it next year or the year after, likely it's going to be in effect. You need to be aware of what regulations you need to meet and what scrutiny you're going to be up against. All right, so I know we talked about a lot, so I want to go over some of the key points, and if you're taking away anything as a regulatory affairs professional, as a MedTech innovator, as a manufacturer, what should you know from this talk? Cybersecurity is a big problem. The FDA guidance is still new, and manufacturers are taking time to get used to it. Even if they've dealt with this current submission policy, this current regulation, it can still be hard to get it right every time. Early consideration is going to seriously save you time. This is going to reduce your time to market and massively streamline your development. If you start with cybersecurity and you finish with cybersecurity, you're going to be ready when it comes time to go to the FDA. Building a secure product development framework, and that's going back to that secure software development lifecycle, is really going to help automate some of these security concerns. You're not going to have to do all of this testing manually. You're not going to have to go through everything every time. It should be built directly into your CI/CD pipeline. You want to identify anything that you have to do early on. So any required policies, any required procedures that you're going to need to develop, those risk management procedures, you want to identify what those are going to be, what is applicable to you, and you want to handle them early. You also want to identify what's your risk tolerance. What level of risk are you going to accept? What is your acceptance criteria? Are you okay with mediums, or do you want to keep it to lows, or do you want everything gone? Have a baseline and stick to it. Documentation should line up with eSTAR. I know that the pre-market guidance says things should be structured one way, and eSTAR says it should be structured another. If you're going to submit into the FDA, your review time will be massively cut down if you're formatting to eSTAR and you're not going in the direction of what the pre-market guidance says. I know this sounds counterintuitive. The words that the pre-market guidance says, how you implement these controls, what are these controls? That is the golden truth, and that should be adhered to. But the format should stick with eStar. All right, now, what are the next steps? You want to start today. If you're in the process of developing your product, have you considered cybersecurity already? Is this something that you can start considering now? When are you planning to do your threat modeling? When do you plan to do your testing? If you're still in the concept phase of your device, well, now you know. Now you know some of the key points you need to start. You want to start with cybersecurity, and don't let any vulnerabilities slow you down. Cybersecurity risks can hold you up for a very, very long time with the regulators. You don't want to be an example like that case study where they were held up for a full year dealing with FDA interactive review. All right, well, thank you all for coming.
You